Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome back to the Sunday morning series of Shiurim. I've done the normal, which is I've put everyone automatically on mute, but please do feel free to unmute yourselves if you wish to join in or to say anything. It's always easier and nicer if it's a little interactive. The topic that we left a little bit hanging, I think, from before the break for the summer and for Yomim Neroim, was the topic of Torah SheBaal Peh, the oral Torah, and trying to understand what it is, what the concept of the Torah SheBaal Peh is, what it includes, what it doesn't include, and how do we understand the wide diversity of opinions and the concept of machlokas in Torah SheBaal Peh. I think in the the break, some of the ideas we discussed included how do we know there's a Torah SheBaal Peh. We looked at the evidence for Torah SheBaal Peh, both within the structure of Torah itself, Torah SheBichsav itself, from which it's clear that Torah SheBichsav isn't an independent work. It's not something that can be understood. We looked at the intuition against the concept of Torah SheBaal Peh. I mean, surely every work should be complete in its own right. Surely every work should be shouldn't need an oral component to it. And we saw that actually, in a sense, every written work has a Torah SheBaal Peh, has an oral component to it. There's no such thing as something which is completely recorded, something which contains within it all the information it needs. The written word, by definition, can't contain certain sorts of information. This is any fundamentals of what the work is about, and certainly includes things like shechita and other things which need to be shown. We saw some of the evidence for Torah SheBaal Peh from archaeological records and other such things. And then we discussed why is there a need for Torah SheBaal Peh beyond the very basic, and some of the advantages or basis for there being Torah SheBaal Peh. As part of the living transmission of Torah, we discussed the idea that it is meant to mold a person and form a person, that Torah knowledge is not just meant to be in the books, but is meant to be carried al luchos libecha, on the tablets of our hearts, that we're meant to carry it with us, and this is also part of the idea of Torah SheBaal Peh. But what we left a little bit unresolved is what actually is included in Torah SheBaal Peh. What are the parameters of Torah SheBaal Peh? What does this body of information contain? And we looked at what we called a spectrum of perspectives, a maximalist position at one extreme and a minimalist position at the other extreme. And we just took this as a means of sort of understanding the full range of opinions, even though there's a lot of middle ground in between also. At one extreme, I took the view expressed by Rav Samson Raphael Hirsch, and even though this was a little bit ahistorical in the sense that I wasn't working through the views and the shittas in a historical lineup, going through the Gemaras and the Gaonim and the Rishonim and Achronim about this, it was just a useful starting point to have a look at, which was the view expressed by Samson Raphael Hirsch, in which he said that the Torah SheBaal Peh, really everything in Torah SheBaal Peh was included as part of an oral tradition. Everything that we know as Torah SheBaal Peh, everything we know as the oral tradition, basically everything not written in the written Torah was part of the tradition handed down from Moshe on Sinai. When we learn a page of Gemara, and we see a lot of discussion in that in the sugya, whether it's droshes, whether it's Chazal making subtle and nuanced interpretation of the psukim, using what we call in English the hermeneutical principles. Hermeneutical is one of these words that none of us know what it means outside this topic. But use some of the halachic principles, which are often used to derive halacha. All of these are in fact merely ways of finding the halachic principles which are anyway established, which are anyway part of the tradition. So I'm just trying to mute. There's someone who I'm getting feedback from. I'm just muting everyone. Please only unmute yourselves if you Sorry, I keep on trying to mute someone who keeps on unmuting themselves. If you can just leave yourselves muted, I'm getting feedback, unless you want to ask specific questions, in which case please do unmute yourself. So all the written Torah, all the oral Torah as we have it, recorded in the Gemara, in the Mishnah, every piece of oral Torah that we have, we should understand as part of the tradition handed down from Moshe Sinai. And when we learn sources of halachic derivation later on in history, these are all merely sources and references found in the written Torah from which we can see the oral tradition, but they aren't the genuine derivation of the Torah SheBaal Peh. The analogy that Samson Raphael Hirsch gives, which we looked at last time, is that of student notes in a lecture. Imagine you're sitting in a lecture and you're hearing a vast amount of information and you're taking very, very brief notes. Now, no one can possibly recreate the content of the lecture from those very brief notes that you've taken. However, for you who remember the oral tradition, you remember the shir or the lecture or the talk that you heard, you can look at the notes and you can tell people what you heard in the shir, and you can point to the notes and you can say, this is the reference, this is where I hint at or I allude to the information that in truth I remember through the oral tradition, through the Torah SheBaal Peh. Similarly, says Samson Raphael Hirsch, when we derive halachas in the Gemara from the subtle nuances of text, from a Gezerah Shava or a Kal V'chomer or anything of the sort, in truth, all we are saying is this is where it's alluded to, this is where you can see the shir note. But don't expect, in fact, to be able to derive the information itself from the written Torah. It's genuinely an oral tradition, and it's a vast oral tradition which contains the full content of Torah SheBaal Peh. How are you meant to relate to that? Is it possible to have such a vast oral tradition? And the answer is yes. I mean, if you dedicate enough energy to it and put enough input into it, and we're told some of the ways that Torah SheBaal Peh was taught over the generations, we know from other cultures, vast oral traditions that existed. There were checks and balances in which many students heard the Masorah from their teachers, and then they handed it over in parallel to the students. There was constant cross-checking and cross-referencing to see that in truth, the oral, the accuracy of the information that was handed down. And of course, we know roughly 2,000 years ago, the Torah SheBaal Peh began being written and eventually fully edited into the Mishnah form under the leadership of Rabbi Nasi, because of the concept of Eis La'asos LaHashem, Hefeiru Torah Secha. Even though it's less than ideal for the Torah SheBaal Peh to be written, nonetheless, Eis La'asos LaHashem, there's no choice. It was being lost due to the era of Roman persecution, and therefore it started being written down. So this is Samson Raphael Hirsch's model. Now, the alternative model, in which we adopt a minimalist position, is one perhaps most clearly formulated by the Rambam, in which the Rambam pretty much says that anything which is listed in the Torah as halacha Moshe Sinai, as an oral tradition handed down directly from Moshe, that we would assume is indeed an oral tradition. And the parameters of this oral tradition are the broad brushstrokes of the structures of what mitzvahs look like. So what a tefillin is, what a lulav is, what an esrog is. These are the sorts of things that you would expect to find in an oral tradition. But any further detail that we have, as per the simplest reading of the Gemara, is indeed derived from the rules of learning Torah itself and reason and svara as used in the sugya. And in fact, when you learn Gemara, this is what it looks like. The Gemara will state a very simple set of halachas, perhaps sourced from the Mishnah and from Pesukim in the Torah SheBaal. And then the Gemara will begin drawing out further details and further halachas, and will seem to derive these from either Pesukim, from a careful reading of the Pesukim, or from Svara, from Kal V'chomer, from other forms of logic and reason as per the Gemara. And the Gemara introduces this search for deriving halachas with the phrase, Minah Hani Mini, where do we get these concepts from? And it seems that it is indeed deriving it from these sources. In fact, the Gemara is full of machlokas, the Gemara is full of argument, And very often the Gemara explains the reasoning behind the argument. Almost always the Gemara will take us through the reasoning. And it would appear to be a human-generated attempt at understanding Torah, which is the source for this multiplicity of opinion. So Rabbi Kiva, Rabbi Shmuel, each will take a different stance and a different way of understanding the psukim, or a different type of svara of what they understand within the way of thinking of Torah to be a reasonable interpretation of the halacha. And out of that will derive machlokas. In fact, the Rambam states that whenever we see a machlokas, we can be sure this is something derived not from oral tradition, but from our ability to reason and to try and understand Torah. Something which indeed was part of Halacha Moshe Sinai, something which indeed was part of the oral tradition, the genuine Masorah, over that you won't find machlokas. And if we look through Shas, there's only several hundred cases where the Gemara explicitly claims an oral tradition going back to Moshe, Halacha Moshe Sinai. As I said, in the simplest reading of the Gemara, most of the time it looks like the Gemara is deriving the halacha from what was learnt in the yeshivas, what was learnt in the Beis HaMedrash, trying to take the halachic principles and apply them to whatever the particular shaila and question in case was. And I pointed out when we looked at this in the last year that there's a balance over here, a scale which is really unavoidable. There's no way to get out of this this trap, this scale, which is if one chooses a maximalist position, as one chooses to understand Torah SheBaal Peh to include an ever larger spectrum of information, an ever larger body of information, one is forced to accept that a large part of this Masorah was lost, that a large part of this Masorah has become a machlokas. If you wish, on the other hand, as per the Rambam, to adopt the view that anything that was part of the tradition isn't a machlokas, then the flip side of what the price, in the sense one has to pay, is one has to include less in the body of Torah SheBaal Peh. One has to make the body, the canon of what was originally part of the Masorah, a smaller body of tradition. As you enlarge the body of tradition, and in a sense you have the safety of a larger amount of it being included in the oral tradition as being handed down to Moshe, the price you pay is that more of it was lost in the Masorah as we have it. The Rambam, who believes that the Masorah as we have it is accurate, nothing was lost from within it, accepts that the Masorah, what was included in Torah SheBaal Peh, was from the start a smaller body of information. So there's an irresolvable tension over here to resolve the two concepts, the two ideas, that on the one hand, what we have of Torah SheBaal Peh is no doubt includes a lot of machlokas. We find a lot of Gemara includes argument. Now, how much of Torah SheBaal Peh has been lost and is really argument? There's no doubt that in this respect, the Rambam is correct. There's no doubt that in this respect, even though we're used to Gemara being full of machlokas, of Gemara being full of argument, the truth is when you look at it with care, the argument is around the edges. So we know what a sukkah basically is. There's no machlokas about what a normal sukkah is. According to the Rambam, this was included in the essence of Torah SheBaal Peh, the oral tradition. According to others, even the more minor details of a sukkah were included in the oral tradition, but some of those were lost. So when we push things to the edges, what's the maximum height of a sukkah? 20 amos or higher than 20 amos. What's the minimum height of a sukkah? 10 tefachim or not? So when it comes to the edges, these things are machlokas. But who makes a sukkah which is 80 centimeters high, the height of a table? Who makes a sukkah which is 20 amos high, which is 30 feet plus tall? So the edges is where there's machlokas. But generally speaking, the body of the essence of what something is, this isn't machlokas, this isn't argument, and therefore it wouldn't be included in, we don't have to worry that the bulk of Torah SheBaal Peh has been lost. Nonetheless, it is true to say, if you take Samson Raphael Hirsch's position, for example, the maximalist stance, then you have to accept that some of the initial Torah SheBaal Peh has been lost, and it certainly raises questions about what happens if we are getting this wrong. In the Rambam's position, we are interpreting Torah SheBaal Peh, so it's not a loss of tradition, it's simply an attempt to interpret it, and again, we'll need to understand what the implications of this, what this is. Now, on the chat, someone asked, is Halacha Moshe Sinai something distinct from Torah SheBaal Peh? And the answer is, this would really depend on your school of thought. According to the Rambam, Halacha and Moshe Sinai is really the essence of Torah SheBaal Peh. What we call the oral tradition is all Halacha and Moshe Sinai, and everything else in the oral tradition isn't part of the Masorah, but is part of what we are trying to derive using the tools we have for deriving the extra information on Torah SheBaal Peh, which we'll discuss shortly. According to Rav Samson Raphael Hirsch, the whole of Torah SheBaal Peh is a tradition dating back to Har Sinai. And in essence, everything is a halacha Moshe Sinai. The only difference between halacha Moshe Sinai and everything else is whether it also has a hint in the text or not. Now, there are borderline pieces of information. There are extra things included in the Gemara which don't fall neatly into these categories, like D'Rabbanans, like Minhag and other such things. But for now, we'll leave these on the side. I did mention last time that the Rambam disputes a position of a predecessor of his, the Bahag, who takes an even more extreme stance, such a maximalist position, that he believes that even mitzvahs Rabbanon can be counted, included in the 613 Tariag mitzvahs that we're used to. Even though we have a tradition that there are 613 mitzvahs, Tariag mitzvahs, the exact count of them isn't entirely clear. Do we include Tefillin Shel Rosh and Tefillin Shel Yad as 2 mitzvahs or 1 mitzvah? So exactly how to produce 613 mitzvahs is somewhat of a debate, and the Bahag, a sefer written in the era of the Gaonim, predating the Rambam, takes the stance that even mitzvahs D'Rabbanon are included in the count of 613 mitzvahs, and his model seems to have been as if there was almost a tradition that when certain events occurred in history or at the right time and place, Chazal would be able to create a new mitzvah D'Rabbanon as appropriate for that particular scenario. And therefore it's, in his view, feasible, possible to say that we can count as mitzvahs D'Oraisa, we can count as 600 amongst the 613 mitzvahs, even rabbinic mitzvahs. But based upon mainstream understanding, post the Rambam at least, and the view of the Bahag, Gemara would include things like D'Rabbanon and Minhag, which are not part of this discussion, but everything else would be included within this debate. Now, Julian wrote in the chat, he says, an example of Gemara of a machlokus over matter of halach in heaven. So we'll look at some of these Agoda Gemaras that talk about these things in a few moments to try and understand some of those scenarios. Someone else posted to me privately, how does Rav Samson Raphael Hirsch have such a different view to Rambam, even though Rav Hirsch is 800 years later than the Rambam? The answer to this is I only used Samson Raphael Hirsch as a convenient summary of what I'm calling the maximalist position, the idea that everything is in Torah SheBaal Peh, everything is included in the oral tradition. But the truth is, this is a machlokas that seems to range across the generations and possibly even finds its source in Chazal itself. So maybe at this point, let's step back. Someone also asked, in the Rambam's formulation, where much of the Torah is just man's attempt to interpret the Torah, doesn't that mean it's less authoritative? We will look at all these things in a few moments. Let's step back for a few moments and just try and see what we know from earlier sources predating Rambam and Samson Raphael Hirsch on this topic. And really, I want to start off from Chazal themselves. What do Chazal have to say about the nature of Torah SheBaal Peh and its origins? So there are a number of, there is no specific source in which Chazal sort of address this systematically. There's no place where Chazal actually say, what is Torah SheBaal Peh? We're now going to tell you about everything that's included in Torah SheBaal Peh. However, there are a number of Chazals that address this topic in Agoda. In other words, they tell us various midrashim and other such sources, which seems to indicate how they understood these some of these ideas. We looked at, I think last time we learnt a number of Gemaras and sources which seem to say that even every detail was given to Moshe on Sinai. In fact, there's a Rashi, which I referenced last time, a very famous Rashi on the beginning of Parshas Bahar. Parshas Bahar tells us the mitzvah of Shemitah, and it introduces this mitzvah with the fact that Bahar, as per its name, this was given Bahar Sinai, this mitzvah was given on Har Sinai. And Rashi asked, why is this mitzvah singled out as having been given on Har Sinai to teach you ma mitzvah Shemitah, the same as the mitzvah of Shemitah was given Chalusel, Protesel, all its details were given to Moshe on Sinai. Similarly, we should know that all mitzvahs were given in their fullest detail to Moshe on Sinai. In other words, there are sources in Chazal themselves in which they do seem to say that mitzvahs came and were derived fully from the tradition, from the Masorah of Har Sinai. However, there are other mitzvahs which seem to say a slightly different take of this. I'm not going to see if I can share on the screen with you a couple of sources around this. Excuse me. Yeah, so you should be able now to see up on your screen a couple. Sorry, I've just lost my screen. A couple of references to these ideas. This is a Gemara in Megillah, for example. Rab Chia Ba'Abba, Rabbi Yochanan. This is at the top of your screen. You should be seeing it now. On the Luchos was written, Kachol HaDvarim, everything which you were taught, Melami Chehereyu HaKadosh Baruch Hu Moshe, Dikdukei Torah v'Dikdukei Sofrim. Hashem showed to Moshe the details of the Torah and the details of the Sofrim. Sofrim is what Chazal call themselves, the sages. Umasha HaSofrim Hasidim L'Chadesh Umaynihu Mikra Megillah. This is a source that sounds like the Bahag that Moshe was shown, even ideas which the Rabbanon Chazal were going to innovate in later times. Rashi says, "Diktukei sofrim, shekdiktachu ha'acharonim and rishonim." Even the details which the sages derived in later generations. So this seems to imply that Moshe was shown the full details of the Torah. However, what isn't said is whether this was part of the living tradition of Torah SheBaal Peh, which was handed down to later generations. And in fact, even in this source itself, we see the tension within Chazal in source 7 in the Gemara and Megillah, Yud Testament base. Because the Gemara says that Moshe was shown that which later generations were atidin, were destined, l'chadesh, to innovate. Which seems to imply that even though this source is taking, in a sense, a maximalist position about the information that Moshe received on Har Sinai, and he was told all the details, it doesn't mean this was something that was handed down through all the generations. There is in source 8 a medrash in Shemot Rabbah, which seems to give a slightly different picture of things. Vayitin el Moshe, Omer Rabavahu, Kol Mem Yom, the 40 days, She'asa Moshe Lamala, Hayolome Torah Shecheach, he was learning Torah and forgetting it. Marlo, it was difficult. He said, Omalo, he said, Rebbeinu Olam, sorry, Omalo, Rebbeinu Olam, Yeshli Abayim Yom ve'eni yodei adov, I've been learning for 40 days and I don't remember anything. Ma'asa HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Mehishlim Abayim Yom, after the 40 days was completed, Nosanos HaKadosh Baruch Hu Torah Matana. He gave him the Torah as a gift. In other words, it wasn't within human capacity to remember it. But then the Medrash carries on. Is it possible for Moshe to learn the whole Torah? The Torah is broader than the world and wider than the sea. Is it possible Moshe learns it in 40 days? Moshe was taught rules and principles, but not every single detail of the Torah itself. So Moshe was taught the details, but not he was taught the klolim, the general principles, but not every rule of it, not every detail of it. I'm sorry. So within the Medrash itself, we find tensions or different perspectives as to what exactly Moshe was taught. And even if we take the stance, as the Medrash seems to say, that Moshe was taught everything, the language is interesting. The Gemara and Megillah, Hereu, HaKadosh Baruch Hu showed him everything. It doesn't say that Moshe remembered every detail as per the Medrash, or indeed that Moshe handed down every detail, because in fact the later source seems to say that the later generations were mechadesh, they innovated some of these ideas. So what are we meant to make of all of this? if indeed we take a more minimalist stance, that much of Torah SheBaal Peh is derived from the later learning of the Gemara, in what sense is this Torah? I mean, the authority of it is granted by the Torah, in which we looked at the sources in the first couple of weeks, in which the Torah grants the authority of Chazal to interpret the Torah. But what sort of Torah is this? What is a Torah which is a partnership between human beings and Chazal and the sages Chazal? What are we meant to make of such a Torah? So I want us to learn together a couple of, again, very famous Agoda sources around these topics, sources that definitely you've seen. They've no doubt been the subject of many a Shavuos share, in which some of these ideas are discussed about what the nature of Torah is. And what I'd like to do is just try and learn them in a little bit more depth, and with perhaps a slightly different stance to how they're often read, and hopefully we'll be able to get some insight into this. And if it's okay, I'm going to share again the screen just for us to learn together a few chazals around this topic. Can you just nod if one of you who's got your video showing, if you can see the screen now? Yeah, perfect. Okay, thank you. The top Gemara, and I'm just going to whiz through them because our time is limited and I want to try and cover as much as we can. The top Gemara is a very famous Gemara, machlokas between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel for 3 years, until a bas kol, a heavenly voice came out. This is Gemara in Eruvin. I've labeled it source 13. A bas kol comes out and announces, Eilu ve'eilu divrei Elokim chayim. These and these are the words of the living God. V'halacha k'Beis Hillel, and nonetheless, the halacha is like Beis Hillel. And then the Gemara carries on, and we discuss the second part of the Gemara in another setting. Since they're both the words of the living God. And why is the halacha like Beis Hillel? And the Gemara answers, they were easy. They were easy to get on with. They used to learn their view and the view of Beis Shammai. They used to let Beis Shammai's words go first. So very briefly, what the Gemara is telling us is that when you have a machlokus between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, at least a bas kol, a heavenly voice, declared, Eilu ve'eilu divrei Elokim chayim. Both of these are the words of a living God, meaning they both have at least some truth to them. Why, in that case, is the halacha like Beis Hillel? In fact, what does it mean even to have halacha? Well, we need halacha because we have to have a practical way to paskin. We have to know how to do things. Why then is the halacha like Beis Hillel if Eilu ve'eilu divrei Elokim chayim? The answer is Beis Hillel's qualities of listening to the other perspective and learning the other view first are not just qualities of good midas and humbleness and modesty and other such fine character traits, but they are also qualities which mean that the halacha should be like you. If you wish the halacha to be like you, you need to hear the other point of view and indeed even learn the other point of view first. In fact, every Mishnah that we learn, even though it's edited by Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, by a descendant and a follower of the school of Beis Hillel, nonetheless, the view of Beis Shammai is always written first. When you learn a Mishnah, it'll always be Beis Shammai Omrim X or Beis Hillel Omrim Y. So to this day, the way the Masorah has been transmitted is as per the way that Beis Hillel taught the Masorah, in which he always taught the view of their opponents, their rivals, Beis Shammai, before listing their own view, and therefore the halach is like them. But we have this interesting phrase, Eilu ve'eilu divrei Elokim chayim, that somehow both perspectives are the words of the living God. What does this mean, that both perspectives are the words of the living God? Well, we have a number of other chazals around these ideas, which seem to suggest that Chazal understood that Torah is genuinely interpreted by human beings. And this is now source 14. The Gemara brings a story about a matter connected to the technical debate of Tzoras. God said, Tahor, and the rest of the heavenly academy said, Tomei. In other words, somehow, midrashically, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is based in learn Torah in Shamayim, and there became a machlokas between HaKadosh Baruch Hu and the Heavenly Academy. Who are these Heavenly Academy? Who are these members of the Heavenly Academy? Possibly human beings who have died, so the Gemara seems to imply. The Gemara then says that they decided that Rabbi would decide the matter, since he was the most learned living scholar, since he was the greatest Talmid Chacham who is still alive. that he was Yochid min Negoim, he was a unique individual in Negoim, and the Gemara brings that eventually, it's a whole story there in the Gemara, that eventually he came up to Shemayim and he paskened the view, which seems to suggest that again, the view of a Talmud Chacham who is learning Torah seems to influence the perspective that of HaKadosh Baruch Hu and the Heavenly Academy itself. So what exactly these ideas mean obviously needs interpretation, but if we understand the concept of Mesivta D'Rakia, the Yeshiva Shalmala, the idea that Torah is being learned on high, what we understand is that there are certain spiritual truths from the perspective of heaven, but somehow when these need to be applied down to earth, it's our view that counts. And then finally, there's the Gemara in Baba Metzia, in which it tells us the story of Tanur de Be'achonai. There's an argument again about the halachic status of a particular oven, the oven of Achonai, and the Gemara there brings a machlokas between Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachomim, between Rabbi Eliezer and the majority of the sages in the Beis HaMedrash, and they brought various miraculous signs to indicate that heaven agreed with Rabbi Eliezer against the majority view, and the conclusion was, Lo b'shamayim, Torah is no longer in heaven. Spiritual truth is no longer to be found on high. It's understood how we understand it. Since Har Sinai, since the Torah was given to us, it's our view that determines things. The bottom line of source 15, the penultimate line of source 15, Achrei Rabim Lahatos. We follow the majority. It's how we human beings understand Torah that the majority is understood. And finally, the last line of this Gemara, Rav Nosson, Ashkechi Rav Nosson Elio, Rav Nosson met Elio, had some sort of mystical experience in which he was given access to what's going on in the Beis Din Shalmala. How did Hashem take the fact that we ignored his Pesach Halacha at this time? Hashem was smiling and saying, my sons, my children have beaten me, they have overcome me. So again, a very powerful Gemara in which it suggests that the the perspective of us here on earth is what counts. Elu ve'elu tiverikim chayim. Now, and there's many other chazals like this. There's another Gemara which brings that how does HaKadosh Baruch Hu learn Torah? When he's learning Torah, what does he learn? He learns Yishmael b'ni says X, Akiva b'ni says Y. Yishmael, my son, my child, says one view. Akiva, my child, says another view. In other words, even Hashem's Torah contains these multiplicity of views. Now, how are we meant to understand this? So there is a Ritva which speaks about the concept of Torah SheBaal Peh, and I'll just share the Ritva before I stop sharing the screen and we do a little bit more talking around this. The Ritva discusses this concept of Torah SheBaal Peh, and this is the Ritva sounds in source 14, and I'll just share this Ritva with you and then we'll talk about this. Elu ve'elu tiverikim chayim. So the Ritva is going on the Gemara in Eruvin, which coins this phrase, these and these are the words of the living God. Sha'alu Rabbeinu Tzafasal. The sages of France asked, two other sages of France, these are what we refer to as the Baalei Tosfos, the Tosafot. These are the sages of France. This is a tradition from the Baalei Tosfos that we don't have as clearly as it was transmitted from the Ritva. In other words, even though we have Tosfos on the sides of the Gemara, Tosfos on the sides of the Gemara is a student-written collection of mini essays on each sugya in Shas, based upon the teachings of their Rebbes. Not every teaching was transcribed, and there were various, we've lost over the generation, various manuscripts of Tosfos also. The Ritva, who was in Spain, received Torah through the Baalei Tosfos also. The later generations of the Baalei Tosfos brought their Torah to Spain. The Rambam was a student of the Baalei Tosfos. The Rosh moved to Spain, and therefore the Ritva had access to various traditions from Rabbanei Tzarfas, from the rabbis of France, the Tosfos. And he says, I'm now going to tell you an explanation of the Baalei Tosfos about this. Heyach Efshar, so we're now back to the Ritva in source 16. How is it possible she used Shneihem Tiverikim Chaim? That both views can be the words of the living God. I mean, surely one or the other is correct. But one of them says it's also, and one of them says it's mutter. How can they both be correct? The Tiritzu and the Baalei Tosfos answered, Ki k'sha'olam Moshe l'morim l'kabel Torah. When Moshe went up on high to receive the Torah, Hereilu al kol dova v'dova mem tesponim le'issa or mem tesponim le'ata. Moshe was taught on each matter 49 perspectives for Issa, 49 perspectives for Heta. And he asked God about this. Well, what's going on over here? You're teaching me everything is viewpoints like this and viewpoints like that. And he said to him, this matter should be handed over to the sages of each generation, and they will be the ultimate ones to make the decision about what the halacha is like. The Ritva says this is a correct midrashic reading, but in the derech ha'emet, the way of truth, which is the language that the Kabbalists of Spain use to refer to Kabbalah, yesh tam v'sod b'dover. There's a separate reason and secret around this matter. So the Ritva brings the view of the Baalei Tosfos. If we think that Moshe was overwhelmed with information when he went up to Har Sinai and he struggled to cope with all the details of the Torah, it now turns out that in fact he was taught 98 times the body of Torah as we have it. Because for each halacha, he was given 49 perspectives one way, 49 perspectives another way, and it was left to the sages of the generation to teach it. And the Ritva accepts that this is a good explanation. And then he says there's something deeper also going on over here. Now,
can I ask a question, Rav?
Yes, please do, of course.
Just because are you also there with the two going ups? So the first time that Moshe went up and the second time, are you saying that is the Torah and the Torah SheBaal Peh, is it the same in both going ups? Or because there's also a school of thought that believes that there's a difference, isn't there? So how does this also fit in?
Thank you for the question. And I would say, by the way, please, anyone who wants to ask, please do ask. One of the losses we pay through Zoom Shiurim are great because they definitely allow people to join. One of the price we pay is that we don't quite get the same interaction as when we used to meet in the main shul with our croissants and our coffee and speak about this. Please God, we will be back and we'll resume that dynamic. There will still also Zoom it, but please do feel free to make this as interactive as possible. It makes it much easier for me to learn with you all when I can see your faces and when you do ask. So the question you asked is, what about the second time Moshe went up? Now this is a very, very fascinating question because according to how Chazal interpreted the Psukim and Devarim and in Shemos, Moshe went up 3 times. The first time to learn the Torah, the second time to do Teshuvah and to daven post Egel, and the third time to receive the Torah again. Now, the first time I understand what took him 40 days. He had to learn the whole Torah. As we saw from the Midrashim, even 40 days is insufficient. The second time was a Teshuvah process. Okay, 40 days is how long it takes to do Teshuvah. In fact, we know this from Elul to Yom Kippur, right? Elul to Yom Kippur, 40 days, and this parallels the 40 days that Moshe spent on Har Sinai doing Teshuvah. But then the third time that Moshe ascended, what happened during that time? If all he was receiving was the second set of luchos, is the full use of the 40 days just carving out the second set of luchos? Is that what takes place in the 40 days? Or is Moshe being taught Torah? If he's being taught Torah, why does he need to be taught it? He learns it already the first time round. All that's changed is that they sinned. They did the Egel, and they were going to get the Torah taken away, and now they had to be given the Torah again and given the second set of luchos. Why does he need 40 days for the third time he's up on the mountain? And it would appear from this that he had to relearn the Torah post luchos, post the giving of the post the Chet Egel, post the sin of the golden calf. In other words, it's a different Torah, subtly altered Torah post the sin of the Egel Hazav, as opposed to pre the Egel Hazav. Now we have a whole genre of commentary on the Torah that tries to analyze some of these changes. So, for example, the description of the 10 Commandments in Devarim subtly differs from the description of the 10 Commandments in Shemos. Possibly this is reflecting a change pre and post the sin of the golden calf, in which the way we apply and understand Torah alters. But the bottom line is Moshe needs to relearn the Torah for 40 days post the Egel Hazav, post the sin of the golden calf. The instructions to build the Mishkan, which at least in the order the Psukim are written, took place before the sin of the golden calf, differ slightly from how the Mishkan was actually built, again maybe reflecting a change, and so on and so forth, a whole extensive literature around this. So it would appear that the Torah was retaught post Egel Azav. From our perspective, though, we're ignoring this point because our focus is simply on whatever the body of Torah as we received when Moshe came down from Sinai, from Har Sinai, whether the first time round or the second time round, what is our relationship to that Torah? How much of that body of information do we have? And to what degree has that is that open to interpretation? And in that context, we've seen the Ritva who interprets the idea of Elu ve'elu as saying that Moshe was taught 49 perspectives either way. Now, on the chat group, I'm being asked a number of questions, including where this leads us and so on. I'm going to put these questions on hold, not because they don't deserve answering, but because we have only 3 minutes left for today's share, and we will obviously continue this next week. For now, I just want to interpret a medrash and understand what the medrash is saying, and then we will revisit it next week and try and take it back to our discussion about what is this endlessly fascinating oral Torah that we learn and where does it come from. First of all, where does the medrash get from that there's 49 faces, ponim, 49 aspects either way? Well, when we see numbers being used in the Torah and in medrash, these numbers are largely significant. For example, whenever you have a chazal that talks about something taking 70 years, it means a human lifetime. So we'll talk about a comet that only appears once every 70 years. It will talk about Chanya Margul going to sleep for 70 years. It will use the number 70 to refer to a lifetime. The number 40 is always a life-changing event. 40 years in the midbar. It takes 40 years for them to go from incubation or conception to reality. Moshe is on the mountain for 40 days. The Meraglim explore the land of Israel for 40 days. A fetus that's conceived has the halachic status after 40 days of being a fetus, not just a fertilized sperm, and so on and so forth. So 40 days is the amount of time it takes for something to achieve, move from being conceived of to being actualized and expressed. So there's always symbolic numbers. Chazal use 50 to mean completion. 49 refers to near completion, but not perfection itself. So, for example, in a negative sense, you're all familiar with the quote that at the time of Egypt, the Jewish people fell to the 49th level of Tumah. Had they fallen to the 50th, they could never have returned. In others, had they fallen to the 50th level, that would have been it. They would have been completely immersed in this. 49 is near immersion, but not completely there. And this is the idea why they choose symbolically 49, Moshe got 49 perspectives either way. He didn't get the 50th perspective. It's impossible to get 50 perspective either side, because 50 is complete immersion, complete clarity. You get 50th insight, then you know the answer. There's no confusion over here. But because he got 49, therefore there was still weighing up both ways. The conclusion would be the 50th insight or piece of information, which even Moshe himself didn't get. So taking the Medrash and translating it into simpler terms for us to be able to grapple with it, what the Medrash is telling us is that Moshe was taught spiritual truths. He was taught halacha. He was taught insight. But things aren't that clear cut. Often about any one situation, there's different perspectives. Even things as simple as, you would think, is it mutar or is it asa? There's ponim lakan or lakan. There's 49 perspectives this way, 49 perspectives this way. Different ways of viewing it, different perspectives you can take, different aspects and angles to it. What is the bottom line? That needs a halachic conclusion. Of course, one has to know in a real system how to live. That's the job of Chazal. Moshe's job is to bring us into a world in which we understand the different arguments that can be made either way. This is the insight of the Ritva into this topic, and next week we will try and understand where this takes us, because this leaves us a little overwhelmed. Then what's exactly are Chazal doing? What exactly is Torah, and what truths can we know out of all of this? And I hope in the next session we'll try and put this together, and it will come out a little clearer. But for now, that brings us to the end of our time. I will save the chat questions that were asked so that I can make sure that I don't miss out anything next time. If anyone wants to ask something live, there is a minute to do so. Otherwise, I'll stop. Okay, thank you very much, everyone, and I wish you a good day. Thank you so much for joining. I'm always very, very honoured that you all take part in this. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you as well from Aaron and Ruth.